Okay, so welcome everyone to the UTSC OVPRI Research Excellence Speaker Series. My name is Joshua Van Rye. I'm a Research Services Officer in the OVPRI at UTSC. I'm here with my colleague from the Center for Research Innovation Support, Christina Congas, who has graciously helped me organize this lecture today. So we want to ensure everyone has the opportunity to participate and can perceive all that is presented today. Should you need to turn on live captions, please go to your meeting controls under More Actions, and you can turn on or off live captioning. I'm going to turn off my video now to ensure a good connection for everyone. So just some housekeeping, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and to please mute your audio and turn off your video to accommodate those who do not have enough bandwidth. We will be hosting the recording on the UTSC Research YouTube channel, as well as the OVPRI website at a future date. This information will be put in the chat box at the end of the Q&A. We ask that participants hold questions till the end of the talk, and if you do have questions, to please put them into the chat box. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Irina Krieg.
Thanks so much, Joshua, and good morning, everyone. I'm super excited to launch this year's Celebration of Research Excellence lecture series. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The Celebration of Research Excellence lecture series celebrates those who have won awards from our office, have received the Principal's Research Award, have been recognized by the Canada Research Chairs Program, or who have been honored by the Royal Society of Canada. Today, we are celebrating Professor Julie McCarthy. Julie was the recipient of the OVPRI Research Excellence Faculty Scholar in 2018. And so you can imagine just how excited we are to hear this talk that we have been anticipating for over 2 years. Julie is a professor of organizational behavior and human resources in the Department of Management. Her research interests include workplace anxiety and stress, work recovery and resilience, and performance management. Julie collaborates on research initiatives, training programs, performance management systems, and selection tools on behalf of public and private corporations that include CIBC, Deloitte, Microsoft, TMX, and Rogers. Her work has been featured in several prominent media outlets, such as the Harvard Business Review, which I read regularly, Julie, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Financial Post, CBC, CTV, and Maclean's. Julie, we're super excited to have you here today to talk about a relevant topic, especially given our times. Over to you.
Thank you, Irina, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the work that I've been doing, in particular around anxiety. And I've been studying anxiety and stress in the workplace for over 20 years now. And my talk today is titled Navigating Disruptive Times, Distressed and Distracted by Workplace Anxiety. Now, the harsh reality is that even before COVID hit, we saw alarming numbers of stress and anxiety, both in our general population and among workers. We knew that 49% of workers were reporting excessive anxiety and stress on a daily basis. We knew that over $320 billion a year was being spent on stress-related illness in North America alone. And the World Health Organization estimated that over $1 trillion globally was being spent annually on stress-related illness. Unfortunately, with the onset of COVID-19, these numbers have become worse. 89% of employees reporting that their work life is getting even worse. 85% reporting well-being is declining. And 52% of Canadians recently reporting increased sleep disturbances as a result of COVID, a phenomenon termed COVID-somnia. And we see this cover of the New Yorker in December of 2020, where we have, this individual very poised with, a martini in hand, looking very professional and happy. And yet all around behind the scenes is chaos. And I think that's something that many of us can relate to. In fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, if we look back to March of 2020, over a year and a half ago, it was spring. Many of us were looking forward to, springtime in Ontario and in Canada. I even had flowers, starting to come up in my garden at home. And in the early stages, all of a sudden, this pandemic hits. It's a global threat. There's very little information. And we saw that individuals' fight or flight responses kicked in. It was remarkable how workers and students across different industries all over the world rapidly responded and adapted to new ways of learning and new ways of working. Fast forward to November of 2021 right now, we are seeing chronic levels of stress. The global threat remains, high levels of uncertainty continue, and we're seeing high levels of pandemic fatigue, exhaustion, and burnout, resulting in feelings of isolation and loneliness. And never before has the study of thinking about stress and anxiety within organizations and among our society become more important. The truth is that back in March, this kind of acute stress, where right away there's a threat in our environment, and we have to figure out, are we going to fight that threat? Are we going to turn around and run away and engage in the flight response? Or are we going to lie down and play dead and freeze, fight, flight, or freeze? That kind of acute stress is not meant to continue over prolonged periods of time. What's happened, in fact, with the pandemic is we've seen it draw out and stretch out, where we are still faced with this uncertainty, and the chronic stress is incredibly detrimental to our psychological well-being and health. And what I want to do in the paper today, as I mentioned, is I've spent a long time studying stress and anxiety as it pertains to the workplace. And I want to share some of my recent work around workplace anxiety. Where I want to start is a theory paper that my former PhD student, Bonnie Cheng, and I published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. Bonnie actually did her undergrad degree in psychology here at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and went on to do a PhD with me in the organizational behavior and human resource area at the Rotman School of Management. Bonnie now works at Hong Kong University. And we'll start with the theory of workplace anxiety to really get a sense of what anxiety in the workplace is from a construct point of view, some of the antecedents, mechanisms, and consequences. We're going to jump then to a study that I conducted in collaboration with a colleague, John Trugakos, here at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and also a colleague, Nitya Chawla, who's at Texas A&M University. When the pandemic first hit, the three of us decided right away that we wanted to collect some research on Canadians to see the experience of Canadians in the midst of this global crisis. And I'll share some of that work now. That study is also published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. In paper 3, we're going to move the focus to job applicants. And I'm going to share some work again in the midst of the pandemic that I've done with a number of co-authors. You can see all their names here from the United States and Ireland, and also from an organization called HireView. And there we're going to look at the drivers and the outcomes of interview anxiety. We're going to conclude by bringing it all together and talk about how it applies, the implications of this. And we'll start with the theory. So what exactly is workplace anxiety? When we talk about workplace anxiety, we're talking about apprehension about the execution and outcomes of job responsibilities. And it's a type of performance anxiety. We could talk about test-taking anxiety. I know we have a lot of students here today, and you can really relate to high levels of anxiety during tests and examinations. We can talk about sports anxiety. There's a whole literature around athletes and the anxiety they experience in sports events. We could talk about job interview anxiety, the anxiety that individuals experience when they're faced with that challenge of interviewing for a job they really want. Anxiety, when we talk about it, can also be dispositional, which is trait-based, or situational, which is state-based. And I'll talk about that in a sec. Here's some examples of a scale that my colleagues and I developed, myself, John Trugakos, and Bonnie Cheng, looking into measurement of workplace anxiety. It's a multi-item scale, and I'm sharing 3 of the items with you. The first, I'm overwhelmed by thoughts of doing poorly at work. I worry my performance will be lower than others at work. I feel nervous and apprehensive about not being able to meet performance targets. And so we can get a sense of really what we're talking about when we're talking about workplace anxiety. Now, before the pandemic, for many individuals, their scores would be high on this kind of a scale. Add in a global pandemic, trying to balance, the personal and the, your career at the same time, trying to balance all of the other things that are happening in the midst of the pandemic, shifts to different ways of working, changes in workloads, those anxiety levels we have seen have gone up even more. Now, when we talk about the trait-state interaction, we can take a peek at this graph to illustrate it. And so on the bottom of the graph, across the x-axis, we have a variety of work situations. For example, a job interview or a performance appraisal meeting, maybe a sales presentation or a business lunch. And across the other axis, the y-axis, we have workplace anxiety. And we can see that our employee A, on average, is higher across each of these situations than employee B or employee C. So from a trait perspective, across varying situations, employee A is higher in that trait-based anxiety, whereas employee C is lower relative to employee A and B. However, it's also important to take the situation into account. For example, take a look at performance appraisals. Employee A actually scores lower than employee B in a performance appraisal context. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. Maybe employee A has a phenomenal supervisor and they have a really strong relationship. So during these meetings, in fact, that their level of anxiety is lower. Whereas for employee B, this is a trigger moment. Performance appraisals, for some reason, are a really highly anxious situation. And so it actually becomes higher than employee A. So when we're talking about anxiety, it's a complex interplay between trait and state characteristics. The complete theoretical model is on the screen in front of you. And you can see it's a little bit, it looks a little complex. I want to point out some of the highlights and then break it down and simplify it a bit. Here at the top, we have the between person or trait-based anxiety. And the portion of the graph below this dotted line is the within person, the state-based anxiety. Here we have the dispositional, trait-like anxiety, and again here, situational. And so we can see antecedents or determinants, core determinants of these types of anxiety. Our outcome that we're focusing on is performance on the job. And we can talk about typical or episodic levels of performance. Now, where I really want to emphasize and what I want to kind of focus on for the purpose of today's talk is really looking at the mechanisms by which anxiety has an impact on performance. And when we break that theory down, we can actually take a look at 3 different mechanisms that Bonnie and I have identified that really play an important role between the anxiety on the one hand and that performance, that job performance or interview performance on the other. The first is emotional exhaustion. When individuals have high levels of anxiety that are related to work, it leads to high levels of emotional exhaustion. And this is a component of burnout. It's one of the 3 core components of burnout. That exhaustion in turn reduces performance. We can also talk about cognitive interference. And so with cognitive interference, that anxiety makes it very difficult to concentrate on the task at hand. And as a result, it reduces our performance again. And finally, we can talk about self-regulatory processing. When we have workplace anxiety, it actually can serve a facilitative function. Part of what we did with this theory is we highlighted not only the debilitative effects of anxiety, but we focused on the fact that in certain circumstances and under certain conditions, anxiety can actually boost performance. It does this through self-regulation. Now, our model predicts a curvilinear relationship, which essentially means that if our anxiety is not too high and not too low, if it's at a moderate level, then what happens is it helps us self-regulate more. It helps us focus on our thoughts and our behaviors and monitor what it is we're doing so that we can achieve those goals we've set for ourselves, ultimately increasing performance in jobs or interview scenarios. Let's talk about each of those in turn. So the emotional exhaustion piece. Over time here, when we're talking about exhaustion, what happens is anxiety depletes energy and it results in exhaustion. My colleagues and I have a study with our CMP officers, for example, that shows that this day-to-day high levels of anxiety on the job among Canadian RCMP officers directly leads to exhaustion, which in turn reduces that performance. What happens is this emotional exhaustion prompts people to distance themselves, both emotionally and cognitively, from the work. Anxiety also triggers cognitive interference, and here we draw from processing efficiency theory and attentional control theories. We see an individual trying to kind of focus on the job and another one in the midst of a job interview. Much of this early research was actually driven from test-taking anxiety research in the realm of psychology, showing that when individuals are faced with the challenge of a test, high levels of anxiety can make it very difficult to concentrate, and therefore performance on those tests is reduced. Same thing happens on the job and in interviews. When we have high levels of anxiety, it can interfere with our focus and actually be very detrimental to our performance. Finally, self-regulatory processing. Anxiety actually signals when there's a discrepancy between a desired state and our goal progress, resulting in higher levels of self-regulatory processing. So it signals to us when, we want to make sure that those goals are met. And moderate levels of anxiety at a certain level can actually increase this self-regulation, allowing us to monitor our behaviors and thoughts and actions and increasing our performance on the job or in those interviews. So self-regulation and self-regulatory processing is a really important and facilitative thing. The highlights of this theory, and we're going to share this theory with all of you today, the more comprehensive version of the theory, is that it's providing a comprehensive framework for understanding the complexity of anxiety and job performance. Not only do we elucidate how and when anxiety plays a role, but we talk about in this theory both the facilitative and debilitative components, those positive and negative pathways. We also identified core moderators. So in the theory, we talk about cognitive ability, we talk about motivation, and we talk about emotional intelligence and the role that those characteristics can play in terms of changing the nature of the relation between anxiety on the one hand and performance on the other. Bonnie and I were really excited when Harvard Business Review decided to pick up this work as well. So in addition to publishing it in an academic journal, we were able to publish it in Harvard Business Review. And here we published a much more concise version that's really amenable, for executives and organizations to be able to use as they plan things and think about personnel selection, work-life balance programs, and leadership development. The second study I want to share with you today is a paper on employee anxiety. And as I mentioned, this one was done in collaboration with Professor John Trugakos here at the University of Toronto Scarborough in the Department of Management, and Nitya Chawla at Texas A&M University. The pandemic, we know when it first hit, it projected humanity into an unprecedented era. It triggered feelings of helplessness and high levels of uncertainty. And often these things there are drivers, this loss of control, this feeling of helplessness is really a driver of high levels of anxiety. And when it hit, John and Nitya and I knew right away we wanted to start research studies to find out what would be happening among, in particular, Canadians in the midst of this pandemic as it pertained to anxiety. Never before have we needed an understanding of how anxiety is impacting core workplace behaviors. So our primary goal was to examine the impact of COVID-19 health anxiety, not only on work outcomes, but also on people's family or personal life, and also on their health. And in this study, we looked at 503 employees from one end of Canada to the other across our provinces. We had 63 females, 90% of our sample was full-time. The average age was 36.8 years. And we began this study the week that social distancing in Canada first was implemented in March. Participants completed weekly surveys for 4 weeks. We actually followed and tracked these participants for 12 weeks. But for this first study, we stopped, and kind of prepared this study for the first 4 weeks. Right now, we're working on the additional data to get it written up for publication. So we remunerated these individuals with gift cards. Here's an example of one of our anonymous participants in March. This was an employee from the construction industry. And it's a vivid example of some of the challenges and the complexities of the emotions that workers were experiencing in the midst of the pandemic. This anonymous participant says, "I'm dealing with feelings of helplessness. Usually I am the one to plan and control every aspect of my life. And in the face of adversity, I simply work harder and smarter. In this situation, I cannot outsmart a virus and the unknown, how it will impact my life, my loved ones, and what impact it will have in my life comes in waves of anxiety." Here's what we predicted or hypothesized in this study. First of all, our focal construct was COVID-19 health anxiety, the extent to which participants in our study were worried or had anxiety about contracting COVID-19. So we looked first at the extent to which COVID-19 health anxiety had an influence on emotional suppression. And here we drew from theories of stress and theories of emotion regulation to predict that COVID-19 is likely to elicit a flight response in people because it's uncontrollable. It's difficult to overcome. We can see that even from the quote that I just gave you. And certainly these stress theories are aligned with that. And because it's something that's difficult and, uncontrollable, right away, the immediate response is that withdrawal response, that flight response. And emotion regulation theories suggest that flight response will actually surface in the form of emotion suppression. Now, emotion suppression is when we bottle up all of our emotions. So we refrain, we're not sharing our emotions with others. We're not talking about our emotions. We're not even writing diaries, right, to share our emotions with ourselves. We're trying to suppress them and push them down and hide them and make them go away. And as we'll see, this is incredibly detrimental in terms of a strategy. We then predicted that suppression, that bottling up of emotions, would actually reduce the fulfillment of needs. This comes from self-determination theory, and we focused on 3 needs from self-determination theory: competence, relatedness, and growth. So first of all, we predicted that suppression we know that suppressing emotions is incredibly taxing cognitively, and it actually reduces our self-efficacy beliefs. And it it's likely to lead to lower levels of competence or feelings that we're not fulfilling that competence need. Suppression also inhibits our social functioning. By bottling up our emotions, we're not reaching out, we're not talking to others, which is decreasing those relatedness needs. The need to connect, the innate human need to connect with one another. And finally, suppression in its very nature is an inhibitory state. And so it reduces feelings of control, leading to reduced autonomy. So when those needs are not fulfilled, we predicted that it would have an impact on our 3 core domains. It would have a significant impact on work by reducing the progress that employees in our study were making on their goals that they had set, the work goals they had set. It would reduce the extent to which they were engaging with family members in their home lives. And it would increase those somatic complaints. So the migraines and, those health issues, health problems would actually be increased. And we did find strong support for our theory. The COVID-19 health anxiety, individuals in our sample who had higher levels of COVID-19 health anxiety, so those who were really concerned about contracting COVID-19, were more likely to bottle up and suppress their emotions, which in turn reduced that need fulfillment. And that reduction in need fulfillment led to lower progress towards goals, lower levels of engagement with family members, and increased health problems. We also looked at one more thing. We wanted to know, is it possible that maybe some of the individuals in our sample are engaging in certain coping techniques that might mitigate or reduce the impact of COVID-19 health anxiety on these downstream consequences? Now, at the time of our study in March of 2020, it's when COVID first hit. And really what everybody was talking about is washing hands. So the World Health Organization, a lot of the politicians and medical experts were saying the best thing you can do is wash your hands. This is before masking and wearing masks actually came out, which came a few months later. So we predicted, in fact, and found that if we looked at whether or not individuals were engaging in problem-focused coping by washing their hands, getting a sense of feeling like they're helping to reduce the impact of this problem, then it would be less likely that we would see these downstream consequences. And in fact, we found support for this. So if individuals had high levels of COVID-19 health anxiety, but they regularly and frequently wash their hands, then it was much less likely that they would suppress those emotions. And as a result, much more likely that we would see positive outcomes in the work, family, and health domains. So overall, this study, first of all, shows us that COVID-19 anxiety has serious downstream consequences for work effectiveness, family engagement, and personal health. We know that emotion suppression is detrimental from this study when a threat is uncontrollable and it results in anxiety. Individuals are likely to withdraw. That withdrawal process from an emotional state is that suppression of one's emotions. And in turn, that suppression leads to negative downstream consequences, including the need fulfillment and the work, family, and health outcomes. We also know from this study that engaging in problem-focused coping in the form of hand washing, a simple, task, was remarkably helpful in terms of minimizing that suppression and those downstream consequences. The third paper I want to share with you is a paper that I have also in the midst of the pandemic on job applicant anxiety. And in this paper, my co-authors are listed below. There are a number of us. Again, it was just recently published. And what we see here, the focus of this was really when COVID-19 hit, a few things happened. We've talked about the pivot to remote work. So lots of individuals immediately had to pivot to online technology. We also at the same time saw an enormous increase in the number of job applicants. And as a result, we saw a massive proliferation of online job interviews. Now, fortunately, before the pandemic hit, I'd been working and collaborating with a company called HireVue that's based out of Utah. And this is a massive online virtual interview platform where they have lots of incredibly large clients from all over the world, and clients will hire them. And if you're hiring, if you're applying to a certain organization, it's likely that you'll be asked to complete a virtual interview via HireVue's platform. And so it would ask you questions and you would record, and we can see an example here. It would record your answers. So it's recording your expression, your speech, everything. And then that is evaluated and used as a performance metric for that interview. The great thing about HireVue also is they have a lot of members on their teams that are research scientists. And so it's incredible to be able to work with individuals on the research scientist part to do lots of these collaborations. Now, our goal in this study, because we had been working with HireVue before the pandemic even hit, when the pandemic hit immediately, I was, sending messages out saying, can we get some additional data? Can we collect some additional data from these applicants around COVID-19 and around anxiety in the midst of COVID-19? And we were able to do that. The goals, what are the core determinants of anxiety in the midst of virtual interviews? And what are the implications of high levels of anxiety in the midst of the virtual interview? We had 8,643 job applicants across 373 companies and 93 regions or countries. As I said, HireVue is a large organization and there's thousands of candidates that are being interviewed with this technology. Now, keep in mind, from the applicant's perspective, it's a double whammy because with COVID-19, first of all, you have the stress and anxiety of being an applicant, and trying to find a job, and then the added stress of having to take this virtual interview. I actually did a mock one before I started the research with HireVue, and I was amazed at how anxious I was even just in this platform pretending to conduct an interview, because it times you and you know that all of a sudden you're being recorded, which automatically can elevate anxiety. So these applicants almost have a double or a triple whammy. Now, what we did is we looked at applicants who were real applicants applying to companies between April and August of 2020. They completed these virtual interviews, they completed additional surveys for us, and we were able to obtain their interview performance via HireVue. Our focus here is interview anxiety. So to what extent were those job applicants worried about their performance in the job interview? For example, I'm worried that my performance will be lower than other applicants. I'm worried about what will happen if I don't, receive a job offer from this company. We looked at two core determinants. So the first is COVID-19 rumination. So to what extent are individuals ruminating about COVID-19? And in our population, we see wide variation. For some individuals in the midst of the pandemic, they can't keep it off their mind. They're thinking about that threat. They're thinking about the uncertainty. And it's a constant rumination, whereas for others, they're able, for whatever reasons, maybe it's the type of job they're in, maybe it has to do with, what area they're in, their personality, that rumination level is much lower and they're able to compartmentalize. So wide variations in rumination. Also variations in COVID exhaustion. To what extent are you emotionally exhausted as a result of COVID-19? Now that could have to do with where you live. Maybe you're in a region or area of the world where COVID at this point hadn't really hit yet. Maybe you're in an area where you're in ground zero and it's like really, had a massive impact on your society. And so we predicted that candidates who were ruminating about COVID-19 and who had high levels of rumination would be more likely to have anxiety in that interview, and that relation would be even higher for candidates who had high levels of COVID exhaustion. In turn, we predicted and found that interview anxiety would have a significant impact on outcomes that both applicants and organizations care about. So we predicted and found that interview anxiety would be associated with lower levels of performance in the interview. It would be associated with higher levels of fairness, lower levels of fairness. So if you're anxious, you're less likely to feel that interview was fair. And you're less likely to recommend that organization to other people. And we found great support for this model. Another thing that we looked at, because we had so much data, is we had information for North America on exactly where these candidates were. So for Canada and the United States, we knew what province they were in, what city they were in. We had it down to a T. We didn't quite have the same level of data for the other regions. But for North America, at least, we were able to get data on how long it had been since COVID had hit, so COVID-19 duration. So the time between when COVID actually started in their region and when that interview took place. We had information on the number of COVID cases by state and province. So maybe if you were in Ontario at that time, the numbers might have been a little higher, for example, than if you were in New Brunswick. And we had information on how many deaths had occurred by state and province. And we predicted that those characteristics, applicants who were in regions where there were higher concentration of cases and deaths, and the duration was longer, that would directly impact their exhaustion. And we found strong support for that as well. So this study actually shows that context plays a really important role. Interview anxiety results from a very complex interplay between environmental factors like that COVID duration and deaths, but also personal experiences in the midst of the pandemic, thinking about that rumination and exhaustion. And when we think about anxiety, traditional models of anxiety are simplistic and overly simplified. And we can see that anxiety actually is quite complex. And we need to really be thinking about the complex nature of anxiety as we kind of continue to conduct research in this area. We also know that interview anxiety matters for outcomes applicants and organizations care about. That anxiety had a negative impact on performance and fairness and recommendation intentions. Now, what this means from the organization's perspective Great care is needed to create platforms that minimize anxiety. Now, I'm working with HireView now, actually. We're conducting additional research to see, in fact, how those platforms can be developed in ways that can minimize anxiety for candidates and ways that can actually increase fairness. We even have a chatbot study that's going to be conducted soon, looking at little chatbots, and how we can maybe use those and leverage those in really positive ways. We know that 80% of organizations are doing virtual interviews, and those numbers are expected to only go up in the future. So this is a really important line of inquiry. From a job applicant's perspective, we really want to adopt techniques to minimize that rumination. And so we can focus on things like meditation. We want to make sure that we can when we have these threats in our environment, that we're not constantly ruminating. We want to avoid activities that lead to emotional exhaustion. I have a paper that also came out in the midst of the pandemic with colleagues, and I'm listing them all below. It's another 2021 paper. And in that paper, we actually look at the effect of news consumption and the downstream consequences of consuming large amounts of news in the midst of the pandemic. We know that news, for the most part, tends to have a negative bias, and we show, in fact, that this news consumption can be very detrimental. One of the things that we can talk about is doom scrolling. So when we're constantly looking at our phones and we're constantly looking at, the doom and gloom that is existing and all of the negative pieces of information. And this, we have to be very careful about doom scrolling and about the news and consumption of news that we are really bringing in terms of our input on a daily basis. We want to build confidence. So the study also tells us that for those interviewers, the next time you have a job interview on your horizon, one thing we can do is mock interviews. They're enormously effective, and practice it virtually. If your interview is virtual, set up a virtual interview where you're on one screen and even somebody's in your room, in the basement or in another room of your home, and dress the part, make it realistic, pre-prepare some questions, videotape it, watch yourself back again. Really helpful. So those practice runs can minimize our anxiety. Prepare a list of the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that you bring to the table so that now you're increasing your self-confidence and self-efficacy. And really here recognizing that interviewing is a two-way street. You have to make sure that you realize that it's not just that this organization is selecting you, but you're also selecting the organization. And so we want to make sure that we put our best foot forward, but also that we're priming ourselves or cueing ourselves in the beginning to all of the great things that we have to offer as well. Let's bring it all together. So we've talked about some different studies and theory on anxiety within the workplace. And really today I've talked about 4 mechanisms. And when we bring it all together, we see that it's really important that we need to minimize 3 of these mechanisms and maximize the 4th. We want to minimize that exhaustion. We want to minimize the emotional suppression, minimize the interference, and really maximize our self-regulatory processing. So with the emotional exhaustion, again, emotional exhaustion is one very important component of burnout. One of the first things we can do is we can look to the massive literature on work recovery, which talks about ways that we can rejuvenate our energy in order to face the challenges and stress that we face on a daily basis. Now we know sleep, enormously important, diet and exercise. We need to be taking care of ourselves. Tons of research from all different realms, medicine, psychology, management, really, and more, of course, showing how fundamental this is. The paradox is that it's during times of high stress, like a pandemic, when really we should be engaging in these strategies even more. But it's also during times of high stress that self-regulation along these lines becomes more difficult. And so we often see that it's during times like this that people are less likely. And so here we see the COVID-somnia increasing as an example. So we really want to remind ourselves to be taking care and putting ourselves first. We can also talk about psychological detachment, and it's not enough to just, from a physical perspective, be rejuvenating. We also need to rejuvenate our minds. And in the work recovery literature, Sabine Sonnentag and Charlotte Fritz have done a lot of work around this construct of detachment, where in addition, like I said, to the physical, we detach our minds from that stress. And this is kind of the opposite of that rumination piece we were talking about. We can also prime positivity at work and home. Priming is setting up our environments, and so setting up our environments so that we're thinking and that we are able to really cue those positive emotions. It could be visuals in your environment, where you decide to put your desk. Is it near a window? Do you have some greenery nearby? It could be, the colors that you're painting the room. It could be the people you're interacting with. It could be the channels of input. So we talked about doom scrolling. What on your news feeds, where are you getting sources of information? And if it's mostly on the negative side, we need to be balancing that. There are it's important to keep up with current news, but a lot of channels are also streaming positive news. So the New York Times, for example, has a stream called The Week in Good News, I think it's called. You can stream that in on your device. And it talks about wonderful, exciting, amazing things that are happening in our world to help balance all of that negative. We can think about, channels like comedy channels. What are you streaming on Netflix on the weekend? There's incredible comedians and, shows that are, you're going to end the show and you're going to be laughing, and laughter is incredible medicine. And so are you, engaging and bringing in channels that are going to bring you happiness and laughter? Martin Seligman is a researcher at Penn State University, and he has done an enormous amount of research in the realm of optimism and gratitude. And he developed a strategy for soldiers in the Army called 3 Good Things. It was so successful that the strategy's been tested with thousands of other groups and is enormously successful. In this strategy, on a daily basis, it's about thinking about 3 things that you're happy about or grateful for, writing them down, and really, seeing what happens. And often if people find it difficult, it means that you need it more. It means that you're probably living your life so quickly that you're in a state of continuous partial attention where you're never really focused on one thing. You just have a million things on your mind. It's about slowing down and being grateful. What is it that we're happy about or grateful for today? And it doesn't have to be huge things. It doesn't have to be that you got 100% on that exam or you secured a new multi-million-dollar client. It could be that conversation you had with somebody in your network. It could be, those flowers kind of starting to come up from your garden. And so it can be those little things. And that gratitude can actually elevate our mood. It can create, harness positive emotions, and it can help mitigate and buffer against burnout and exhaustion. Cognitive reappraisals, from my PhD is in psychology, actually. And when we talk about cognitive appraisals, this comes from the realm of psychology again. We can talk about the fact that in some cases, and sometimes in many cases, it's not necessarily the negative thing that has happened to us that's problematic. It's our interpretation of that event. And in fact, the very same thing could happen to all of us, on this webinar this afternoon, but the way we interpreted that event would likely be very different. And sometimes what we need is just to reassess and interpret things with a more optimistic outlook. And I have a picture of a camera because a really great analogy is the camera, a camera analogy. And the next time that something happens to you that's really upsetting and that really raises that anxiety and stress, I want you to try to look through a long lens of a camera. So instead of that short lens, we're going to swap it out for a long lens so we can see further into the future. We can ask ourselves, is this situation that's really causing stress and anxiety, is it going to be on my radar in the future? And the vast majority of time, the answer is no. In many cases, it will not be on your radar 2 years from now, or even a year from now, or even next month, or even next week. And so we can put on that long lens to try to put it in perspective. We can also use a wide lens and ask ourselves, is this issue or event which feels so anxiety provoking, is it really affecting my entire life? Or is it affecting a component of my life? And in many cases, the answer is that it's a component. So maybe it's something to do with school or work, for example. So if we put a wide lens on, we're not just seeing a sliver of what's in front of us, we're seeing with a fisheye lens, a broader picture. And even if it's a school or a work thing, we still have so many other components. You have your health, you have your family, you have your friends. But even if it's work, for example, often it's not everything about work. It's a sliver of work. Maybe it's something to do with one client, or if it's school, it's something to do with one class and one test. So we have to adopt a wide lens. And finally, we can flip our lens. Often we're really hard on ourselves and we want to be realistic, but at the same time, we need to recognize that often these things that we're upset and anxious and really stressed about extend beyond just what we have done. And often there are other people, there are other circumstances that have played an important role. So we can flip that lens and we can say, if somebody else was to look through that camera at you, would they really say that this is all your fault, that this situation or event only has to do with you? And the vast majority of cases, the answer is no. There's many other individuals, there's environmental circumstances, there's other things that have come to play a role. And so this is the cognitive reappraisal, where we can think about looking at things from another angle, which can be very helpful. Emotional suppression, that bottling up of emotions. As I showed today, this can be incredibly detrimental. And one of the first things we can do is check in on ourselves to really assess our current emotional state and what the underlying causes are. And not only on ourselves, check in on those within your networks. As leaders, we should be checking in on our teams. We should be checking in on a personal level, all of us, on our family members and more. Checking in on fellow students in the midst of this is really important as well. Engaging in that emotion-focused coping, so reaching out to others, joining teams and groups, really accessing our network, so boosting those facilitative relationships. So those relationships that are uplifting and facilitative, really trying to boost those even more. In terms of cognitive interference, here we need to stay focused. We want to minimize distractions. I know some of you, we have multiple screens and multiple electronic devices, and switching back and forth across all these tasks actually depletes the time we have in the day. So by avoiding that multitasking, we can actually accomplish more and the quality of our work becomes higher. It's also important to create firm boundaries. We know with the onset of COVID, boundaries between work and personal life in many cases have disappeared. Work is home, home is work, and those boundaries are really important. And so we want to establish those firm boundaries when we're working and we're in that workspace. We can be focused on work. And when it's our personal time, we can be focused on that rejuvenation and that personal time. And there's a great literature, huge literature around work-life boundaries and creating those. Being mindful, so really staying focused and mindful of our surroundings. At UTSC Scarborough, we're very fortunate. We have Zindel Siegel, who's a psychology professor, and he has done an enormous amount of groundbreaking research in the field of mindfulness. He's written many articles and several books that you might want to take a look at. Part of this is mindful listening. So it's not only being mindful ourselves, but in those connections with others. You see how this all interconnects when we're connecting with others, really, truly listening to them. Considering meditation and breathing techniques. Research shows that these techniques can help us focus, and they actually can rejuvenate and build our resilience. Self-regulatory processing, really important to be self-monitoring. And one of the first ways we can do this is to start journaling. Research on leaders, for example, that when leaders are actually engaged in the process of journaling, they're recording their thoughts and behaviors and their goals. It actually increases that leadership effectiveness. It also increases your personal satisfaction. But it extends so far beyond leaders. We have research in other realms as well, that this process of journaling and tracking and recording is enormously effective. We want to set realistic goals and follow them. So we don't want to, we know that over time, we want to set these goals, but we know it's not always a clear path, a straight path to those goals. It could be bumpy. We could go up and down a little bit, and that's okay. Just keep following those goals. We'd like conducting mini experiments. So Sue Ashford, she's an incredible researcher, and she just came out with a book. I just received my copy. Haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's called The Power of Flexing. And really, she talks about the fact that we need to really be conducting mini experiments in our world. Another thing that we learned from the pandemic, and that I've learned from the research that I've been doing since the pandemic, no two situations are the same. It's challenging to say, here's a one-stop framework that everybody should be following to minimize burnout and anxiety in the midst of this. You know, as individuals, we have different needs, we have different backgrounds, we're in different situations. So what works for one might not work for somebody else. And as a result, we need to kind of think about trying different techniques, but really observing to see if they make sense and if they're working. And if they are working, keeping them in our repertoire. And if they're not working, trying something else that might work for us. So making these changes and monitoring, which really loops back to the starting a journal, right? To really self-monitoring. And for job applicants, those mock interviews can really help. So where I want to end today, putting it all together, is I want to suggest that in our lives, we set a lot of goals for ourselves. And I know that we have students and staff and faculty and more with us today, and thank you for coming. And I know, first of all, that we set performance goals. So where we want to be in terms of our career, where we want to be for academics in terms of the publications and that kind of trajectory, where we want to be as students in the next, semester and with the courses we're taking and the grades we're getting. Those performance goals are important. We want them to be realistic, challenging, but realistic, and we want to continue to set them. We know the second kind of goal is learning goals. And the fact that, you're all here with us today, and thank you for joining, means that you've already put learning goals as a goal that's high. Life is a learning journey, and we want to continue to learn and evolve. And those learning goals should be equally as important as those performance goals. And I hope that you will also set, if you don't already, a third type of goal that's equally as important as those performance and learning goals, and that's your well-being goals. And well-being goals, we know, we've talked today about 4 very important ways to increase that well-being, to try to mitigate that anxiety and stress by minimizing our exhaustion, minimizing our suppression, minimizing that cognitive interference, and boosting that self-regulation. We know, even from the studies I've shared today, that these strategies increase job and interview performance. They can increase perceptions of fairness. They can increase your attitudes towards organizations and others. They can increase your engagement with your family members, and they can even increase your health and well-being. And so much more. When we look to the broader literature, so many more outcomes can also come of this. So I encourage you, set those well-being goals that are equally as important as those performance and learning goals. I'm going to end. Thank you so much for your time. My email is here. Please feel free to reach out to me with any additional questions or comments that you might have. And a final slide with the 4 papers that I discussed today. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye now.
Julie, thank you so much to you. The internet problems no doubt led to higher workplace anxiety for you today, but you were able to suppress any emotional or cognitive interference to self-regulate and give an excellent performance. And I want to specifically thank you for giving such a hopeful talk, because I think that you really gave us tools to show us how we can manage the anxiety that each and every one of us feels. We only have about 3 minutes, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So I would like to ask one question maybe of you. And it is this: COVID has placed a huge strain on our human connections, which is causing and leading to a lot of anxiety for people. And this may explain why some people in the chat talk about surviving, not thriving, and longing for normalcy. Do you have any suggestions in terms of how we should be thinking about and managing interpersonal relationships right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that's happened in the pandemic also is when we're thinking about our interpersonal relationships, the ones that are really facilitative and engaging are the ones that often we kind of pull away from a little bit. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping those strong interpersonal relations with people that build us up and lift us that maybe we haven't we've kind of let slide in the midst. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is really it's through the communication. And now that, you know, even things are opening up, so if we can get together in person, that's great. The listening piece has never been more important. And so it's really that mindful listening where when others are trying to express what's happening to them and when we're interacting, we're not jumping in immediately with our thoughts. We're not jumping in to talk about our experiences. We're really sitting back and engaging in that active listening piece. And when I do sessions on burnout and resilience, I do interactive sessions where it's so simple. I just put people together and I make them listen to one another without interrupting. And the depth of those conversations is remarkable. And I've done it with individuals at all levels of leadership and in organizations, because so often in our busy worlds, we're not used to just really giving people our undivided attention. And it allows them to express themselves and to not suppress those emotions. So I would say in your relations, if you could really think about whether you're on Zoom or whether you're in person, I know it's tempting to jump in and say, I know I've been experiencing the same thing, and jump in really quickly, and that's okay, but we want to hold off and we want to let our speaker really have the opportunity to share everything they want to share before we jump in too quickly. So I'd say that's in the 3 minutes, that's one quick technique.
Thanks so much, Julie. And again, I wish we had a whole day to talk about some of the things you presented today. I hope we can have a follow-up at some point. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Joshua to close out the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina, and thank you, Professor Julie McCarthy. It was a very, very interesting and salient talk. I think we managed even with the technical difficulties. And thank you for everybody for joining us today. Just a reminder that the next Research Excellence Lecture Series will be Wednesday, December 1st, and we have Dr. Nick Mandrake scheduled for that talk. Here's some links to Julie's page, as well as our own YouTube channel and our website. I will be adding the papers Julie referenced today to the chat shortly, the PDFs of the papers. So feel free to download those and take a look. And yeah, thank you again, everyone, for showing up.